Good afternoon. Hello, nice to see you. It's really, really wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be in the room with lots of people who I know and love and have read, and excited to talk with people who I don't know yet, maybe don't love yet, but maybe will. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for the conference organizers for structuring a space, right, like Bud was just speaking about, where we can be with each other and think about these ideas and put ideas together. It's a truly stunning gathering of beings, and I'm honored to be here. Grateful to be a guest for the first time on these lands of the Fourth and Sixth Treaties. When I arrived here yesterday afternoon, that was actually the same flight that Bud arrived on as well, and my friend and colleague Eve Tuck had arrived a little bit earlier. We were all waiting in the luggage area, and there seemed to be a delay with the luggage coming out. And it was communicated that the baggage handlers were disallowed from unloading the baggage while there was lightning going on, that was part of an agreement. And to me, this actually made immediate sense. In walking out of the airport in the plane, the air feels incredibly familiar to me. I spent my teenage years growing up in similar prairie lands south of here in Nebraska in the United States. And so there's something that feels very, very familiar to me about the air, about the humidity, about the temperature, about the ways that the summer skies will turn cobalt deep blue, like the steel underside of a ship, so close and so low and so thick you feel like you can just reach your finger up and swirl the color above. That feels very familiar to me being here, because I spent my teenage years in the Midwestern part of the United States. And of course, I don't know very much about this space. The land, the humidity might feel a little bit resonant and familiar to me, but I don't know about this space. I don't know about the activities, the interactions, the participants, the human beings, the non-human beings that have been in contact with each other, that very much is part of this physical space that we're in as well. And I thought it was important to note that, what I can know and not know about this space, as a way to interrupt this logic and hubris of universal knowledge, being able to universally know. Although it might feel familiar to me, I can't know it. This logic, this ability to know universally is certainly one of neoliberalism, and its assertion that complex beingness can be collapsed into single variable metrics of profit and loss. But this logic is more fundamentally the logic of coloniality, the logic of Eurocentrism, as Professor Marie was speaking about a little bit earlier today. A logic that seeks to order and classify along metrics of beingness, along metrics of humanness. Is everything all right?
Hoping to turn these lights off.
Okay.
Really work well.
Oh, don't go to sleep. Maybe that's for me. I should go to sleep. Right, lights, camera, neoliberalism. Okay. So I think of neoliberalism, and this has been a little bit in the room today. One of the things that I'm intending to do is talk less than I was originally intending to do. Famous last words from an academic, I know. But I am intending to talk less, and I'm also intending to throw out some questions that seem to be starting to build throughout the day. And one of those questions I think that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to pay attention to is, what's the genealogy of neoliberalism? I think of coloniality when I'm looking at the logics of neoliberalism. We've had an opportunity to think about that through Eurocentrism today as well. So I think this is one of the things that we might maybe turn to somebody sitting next to us or behind us, in front of us, and talk about what is the genealogy of neoliberalism? How do we understand coloniality, Eurocentrism? What kinds of vocabularies, what kinds of language best affords us an ability to name what its logics are, so we can feel when it's populating itself through us, so that we might be able to better reach beyond it. So I think of neoliberalism definitely in terms of coloniality. It's arguably the most steroid fuel iteration of coloniality, which seeks to create lesser, meaning disposable, meaning erasable, meaning fungible, but it does that through creating that which is higher, more meritorious, to loop in that word from earlier this morning. That higher, that more meritorious is sought in order to have dominion over the lesser beings, which helps in the unquenchable thirst for material accumulation. So what I'm speaking of here, I'm sampling from the work of Silvia Winter, and I consider myself a student from afar of Silvia Winter's. And in particular, this essay that I have the title of here on the slide, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom, just, a few things. In this essay, and I should use these motions to call this an essay, Winter pushes the reader to understand the core colonial project of lacerating connections among land, heavens, and beings in order to rank, sort, and categorize, to have the power to deem who is higher and who is lower. She describes coloniality as core to the centuries-long project of delineating statuses of worth, and from those categories of human and not, better land and lesser land, the ability to own that land, to remove its essence of beingness, render it as object, and to do the same thing with other beings. Coloniality has kept stable, as much as it shapeshifts, it has kept stable this core project of material domination. Whether through religious or state-defined worth, this is a thing. Before the market was dictating the state, the market dictated the church as well. The church actually was governed by metrics before the state, and that's helpful to understand the logics of merit and value. And again, what's in common across these projects is the creation and use of metrics for a purpose, for the purpose of domination, and its complement subjugation. So looping in some language from Bud's talk previously, what is the knowledge project for? When we understand the enclosure of knowledge, what is that for? What is its purpose? Metrics and evidence, of course, are not in and of themselves bad or good. Their utility and impact can only be known, as Winter theorizes, through an analysis of what the teleos is of the purpose. So within settler colonialism, how are claims of knowledge, of what learning is, and who can learn? What do the settler colonial logics look like and sound like in the material, cultural, and political structures of higher education, as formal places of learning and as state arms of settler nation states? So this is the typed words of graffiti that was scrawled across a dorm room door in the September of 2012 at South Dakota State University. This overwhelmingly apt example is both ironic and telling on multiple layers. Indigenous peoples are named as intruders on a land-grant university established on indigenous land. Lakota student Ernest Weston, although not one of the residents of the two rooms at South Dakota State that were targeted here with this graffiti, he broadcast a hate crime via social media where it received appropriate attention, I would say, in many Indian news sources, but went virtually unnoticed in mainstream circles. That this egregiously obvious example of backlash to diversity, and I speak as somebody who is often labeled as a representative of diversity on college campuses, for me, I think the gift of that, and the gift that has been present throughout my formal education, is I have never expected these institutions of formal education to welcome me. That has never been my expectation. I have always been able to understand and see and feel the learning and teaching that happen in spaces outside of formal education, as well as understood how formal education knew me, saw me, or maybe more appropriately, depicted or said didn't know me or couldn't see me. So that this graffiti occurred as a backlash to perceived diversity is based in property rights, is based in the idea of universities as one of the core locations of whiteness as property, to coin the title of Cheryl Harris's essay. This is just a glimpse into how settler colonialism plays out in higher education. It explains why within settler nation states like Canada, the United States, and Australia, the mere perception of rising diversity leads to white settler backlash. And it also tells us something about the place of learning within these formal institutions. These backlashes make more sense when we remember that institutions of higher education have always been extensions of state projects of coloniality. operating as sites and examples of that whiteness as property. This structure is thoroughly captured in the buildings and the products of higher education, from the most elite Ivy League schools in the United States being built literally by enslaved peoples, as Craig Stephen Wilder documents in his book pictured here, to the ways that curricular and pedagogical assessment practices were designed in the mind of the universalized white upper middle class male population that sometimes, like here, maybe let in a woman or two. Maybe if she leaned in enough, I don't know. And it's not just in the buildings, but in how research projects were named worthy, meritorious, fundable, and publishable. So one of the things that Bud was saying at the end of his talk just a few minutes ago was that it's important for us to think about I'm using the word coloniality here, drawing from Silvia Winter, in the specific different locations where it takes shape. So what does that look like in a school of nursing? What does that look like in a school of engineering? How does that sound in the halls of the central administration office? I'm speaking as a professor of education, so I am fascinated and romantically obsessive about learning, and I am simultaneously irate with my field for having all but abrogated its responsibility of guarding, of really protecting, of being answerable to what learning is. And I have to remember a certain of coarseness with how that's happened. I have to remember that as much of a fan as I am of the idea of the public, of the collective, that land-grant institutions in the United States were established as institutions of higher education dealing with agriculture and engineering precisely because that was mostly populated by white land-owning men. That's how land-grant institutions were started. So I have to keep in mind that genealogy every time I get so salty with schools of education for not protecting learning and instead trying to govern test score achievement. It helps me to remember the kind of phrase of it. We kind of come by it honestly when we look at this as a genealogy, when we look at this as the architecture of epistemology and the architecture of the buildings. It helps me to remember then that research is a cultural practice and to know better the antecedents of that culture, the descendancy of that culture, the contemporary colonial logics of that culture. And here I'm heavily sampling from and greatly indebted to the work of Professor Marie Baptiste, whose book, Decolonizing Education, calls us to pay attention to that in order to nourish the learning spirit. Baptiste discusses research as a cultural practice. This pursuit of knowledge is shaped by who is doing that, the cultural context in which they're living. And so how could we ever expect otherwise? So researchers, of course, do not sit outside these dynamics, and especially if we start looking at the demographics of who researchers have been, who have been promoted through the ranks, these realities make sense. The seemingly generic questions of what is knowledge, what is learning, are never generic. They can only be known in the specific. And yet educational research, my field, has endeavored to find a central tendency and a universal trend to these questions. And this is sadly not just within the approaches that focus on quantifying. So I'd like to share with you two examples that are fundamentally qualitative in nature, that I believe that draw from interview and observation. I believe have within them both this architecture, this genealogy of coloniality, and the fact that learning is bigger and brighter and will outlast coloniality. Learning predates coloniality and it will outlast it. And I think that all of that is contained within these couple examples. Anybody know who that is? Random quiz to a room of 100 people. So not a very good pedagogical technique. That is Edwidge Danticat and her children, and that is an office where she writes. Edwidge Danticat is a Haitian author, the author of novels including Farming the Bones. This is a photo from when the New York Times interviewed her. She'd recently been named a MacArthur Genius. And they were interviewing her and a series of other writers and these photos of where they do their writing, where the magic happens, basically. And Edwidge Danticat was asked by this reporter what books she grew up with and what her memories were of being read to as a child. And right there, this framing echoes the tacit taken for granted that have become synonymous with literate childhoods, with success, with achievement, and the subsequent role of the family and the household, which is to saturate a child in print-based texts, to model particular kinds of literacy. And with these steps in place, success and educational achievement are sure to follow. And so it makes sense to ask Edwidge Danticat, how did that look like in your childhood? Surely those things must have been there. This companion logic being that if they were not in place, well, surely one would not be named a MacArthur genius. It's the logic of grit, where we study the characteristics of people who have succeeded well in society and then downward apply them in deficit fashion to those who have not succeeded. And this is a fundamentally colonial logic. It's fueled and narrated by linear ideas of progress and achievement that can be understood as neoliberalism, but I think more fundamentally are about the perpetuation and protection of stratification, and therefore is a fundamental project of coloniality. But back to Ms. Danticat, and this is where the learning is bigger than the colonial framing. When she was asked this question, framed through the success, achievement, rendering of those at the top of the heap, she paused and then she flipped the script. She said, you know, I didn't grow up with a lot of books, but some. Actually, I only owned one non-school book before I was 12. I was not read to as a child. Instead, I was told fabulous stories by my aunts and grandmothers and many family friends. Brilliant, huh? So she definitely, and quite generously, I think, reorients the question through her answer to what in her childhood context was deeply, richly, abundantly communicative. So I'm drawn to this example for a number of reasons. I'm drawn to it because it has within it both this colonial frame of, well, you've achieved, so therefore you must have done these things. You must have been sat upon the lap of your mother with lots of different books every night and read to aloud. So tell us which one of those were your favorite books. And she flips that script in order to say, I hear your question. Actually, this is what learning looked like in my home. This is what communication looked like in my home. I'm certainly also drawn to this example as the daughter of immigrants, as the daughter of third world migrants whose migration patterns both reflect sanctioned and also subjugated migration and movement across the world. I'm drawn to this example about the ways that I knew learning and knowledge and matrilineal ways of relating that didn't resonate in any of the schooling contexts in which I found myself. So there are several things that draw me to this, and I share it with you not just because it is such a beautiful example, because I think it also runs throughout the kind of research that I do. And one of the things that I'd like to posit to you and to myself is that research as always fundamentally ontological and specifically epistemologically connected, it behooves us rather than compromises our research to identify through what kinds of voices we are expressing it. It helps us to better connect, as we've heard in the day, how my research, how my documenting, how the way that I understand this story can be heard by somebody listening to it. That is facilitated by me being explicit about the reasons why I am drawn to certain questions and certain stories, certain realities. So, as promised, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. I think that one of the reasons, or within this question that was posed to Edwidge Danticat, is also certainly some racialization going on. Like, wow, tell us what it was like for you. Person who's a MacArthur genius, one of the top writers living right now, but that when her country is typically described, it's described as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. So, wow, tell us about these literate experiences. Her response refuses this kind of soul linear trajectory, a grounding that perhaps because it's more quizzical, this question that's asked her is more quizzical because of, as a Black third world woman, how did that literacy come to happen? It flips this kind of commitment to the solid central line. And what she says in her answer is, you know what, I was actually more like that curvy red line. That's how it happened for me. So another example that has both some of the things that we can gravitate towards learning and then the ways that it gets framed through colonial logics. This is a picture from children learning in the Hefei district in China. There's a Western researcher named Jim Stigler who was studying how different people learn in different parts of the world. And he's describing this in an interview that was aired on NPR, and he was noting with awe how a young Chinese child was sent to the board to work through a maths problem. Couldn't do the problem, couldn't do the problem, couldn't do the problem, was staying at the board trying to figure it out. Meanwhile, this researcher sitting in the room is having, I think, sympathetic panic attacks on behalf of this child, like, oh, he's not getting it, he's not getting it, he's not getting it, he's failing in front of everybody. How traumatic, what's going to happen? But what he came to learn, and this is in the write-up of the story, the airing of the story, is that in Eastern cultures, this is a direct quote from the story, in Eastern cultures, struggle is taken as a sign of learning. Struggle shows that you've worked hard, and itself has become a way of demonstrating the learning or the appearance of learning. And right there in this short telling of this story is both a very fundamental aspect of learning, that is failure, that is trying and failing and figuring out what is going on in the failing, and yet then an attention to what are the indicators of that failure? What are the metrics of failure? How can we measure failure? How can we know, in this case, if learning has happened through a display of failure, through a display of struggle? So I think that there's lots of opportunities to attend to the more robust ways that learning actually occurs, and ways, those are opportunities for us to imagine ourselves out of, in my field, how we've truncated and collapsed learning in very colonial terms of achievement through test scores that somehow are supposed to lead one up through a stratified society to the top, and that will somehow equally afford that opportunity to everyone. So when I think of turning from those logics of coloniality that see knowledge and research as property, as consumable, as universal, for me, and these are words that have come up earlier in the day, certainly it has to do with learning, knowledge, and research as relational. And I have a picture here of an outrigger canoe, paddler canoe, because that was for me a formational experience, a foundational experience where I understood that you're not going to get anywhere if you're not certainly not going to get anywhere you may want to go if you're not paying attention to a number of different information points constantly. And you have to pay attention to them constantly because they are unfixed. The person sitting in front of you, the person sitting behind you, the ocean line, the skyline, the water. You have to pay attention to all of these evidentiary points. But they are all unfixed. They are all fundamentally unknowable in a static way. And research and learning and knowledge are, as well, fundamentally unknowable. So I wonder what it would be like. I want to put up one other image here of learning, an idea of learning that really captures my attention. This is a picture of two young people interacting with a portion of the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, Alabama. This space is one explored by Elizabeth Ellsworth in her book called Places of Learning. She writes, "Such places of learning implicate bodies in pedagogy in ways that the field of education has seldom explored. As they do this, they encourage and challenge us to move away from understanding the learning self merely through notions of cognition, psychology, and phenomenology, and as being subject to ideology only." So that sounds really cool to me right there, pedagogy as embodied. But what sounds even better to me is, what if we think of learning as fundamentally fugitive, as a fundamentally unknowable act, as this releasing of our hand from a rung that we have a very firm grasp on and reaching for something that we have no idea of yet, of letting go of what we think we know that actually is probably fundamentally unknowable, and leaping, not knowing what we may know in the future. That, to me, is what learning fundamentally is. That is not subject to easy metrics. It is, in fact, elusive of easy metrics. But I think if we are answerable to that in my field, if we become answerable to learning, which is something that perhaps all of higher education might think about, that's a way that we might be able to imagine a new world into existence. I don't have any idea what that new world would look like, but I know that asking questions around unknowability is a better mistake. Sure, there's going to be lots of mistakes, but probably likely better mistakes than which knowledge should we teach instead of the knowledge that we're teaching right now. Which unknowability should we make space for rather than the knowability that we try to protect and govern? So I lied. I'll close with one other slide. This is from Silvia Winter again. Winter asks us to think carefully about the ways in which those currently inhabiting the underside of the category of man as human, under our current epistemological regime, those cast out as impoverished and colonized and undesirable and lacking reason, can and do provide a way to think about being human anew. And this is another quote from her that you have up there. She talks about the difficult task of situating our intellectual questions outside of our present system of knowledge in order to historicize and share and perhaps shape our futures differently. So as we're sitting in this room together, I've been thinking about what are the different portions of knots that we're having mapped out for us. And how does having a portion of the knot of coloniality help us to understand another portion of the knot of coloniality? How can we understand these things as distinct and separate and fundamentally connected through their distinct locations? So I will stop there. I'm going to ask us to do something a little bit different, because we have a heap of time, right? Yeah. So I thought maybe let's do this instead of questions and comments posed to me. Like, we can do that. But I thought it might be nice just to be able to turn to somebody and talk about something that you've heard so far today. I think I just am feeling like let's have some digestion time in terms of the ideas. So can we do that for 10 minutes, and then maybe we can just do a few thoughts that arise during that time, and people can speak to anything that I've spoken about, obviously, but I think it just might be nice to have a little bit of like connect time within people, and then we can regroup. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the larger room, a question you'd like to pose or a comment that you'd like to make, and that doesn't need to be to me? I'm just standing in front of the thing that has a cord with it. Although there's lots of, anyway.
There's two to choose from.
No, the people are beating each other down.
Although I'm doing the camera work, I did pay my registration fees. Well, one of the, especially the picture of the students interacting with the sculptures, sort of reminded me of another issue we may be talking about later, but that whole division of core and option in our school system, and how it raises certain ways of knowing and diminishes other ways of knowing. Can you reflect on that for a minute or two?
Yeah, sure. For many minutes, probably. Right, there's so much going on. Like, let's just talk about the bodies. Like, thanks for the comment. Schools are such profound places of training bodies to sit just like you're sitting in these little L shapes that are horrible for your bodies to be sitting in for this amount of time, right? Like, when the much love, we love the space, we're really happy to be here. This is horrible for our bodies to be sitting in these little L shapes. And this is fundamentally one of school's roles, is to not just shape the body into these L shapes, but to do so as to contain activity and to direct eyes towards somebody who purportedly, and ears, is purportedly going to tell you the things that you need to know. And right there, right, like colonialism is always coloniality is always enacted upon bodies. It is always enacted upon living beings, and the land as one of those living beings. It is always enacted upon material living beings. So part of the way it does that is to confine and to discipline and to tampen down the activity that might be there otherwise. Yeah. Thank you.
So we were talking a lot about that beautiful quote that you put up there, the difficult task of situating our intellectual questions outside our present systems of knowledge in order to historicize and share and shape our futures differently. And we were really trying to understand how we could we could move outside of our present frame of knowledge, and whether that's even possible, or whether it's maybe about stretching, you know, like dehabituating, like we're all in a classroom like we always are here, and well, not everyone is probably not always are, but I'm a doctoral candidate, so I feel like I'm always in a classroom. So so maybe it's about stretching, I don't know, or maybe you could share or expand more about that, like what are some different techniques for trying to move outside to de-habituating. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the reflection and question. I'll just share one thing with you, a practice that I do when I teach a critical race theory and intersectionality class, something that which is a doctoral level class, advanced doctoral level class, in the spring term in Boston, in the Wampanoag territory where I teach it. There were 27 doctoral students in this class, which is quite a lot. And one of the assignments that I asked the students to do was about halfway through the semester, I asked them to do a current events project. I wanted them to take the language that they had been working with, the ideas of critical race theory and of settler colonialism and of intersectionality. I wanted them to choose something from current events, something in the media, a television show that they were fond of, and apply these tools to it with, like with this loving recommendation, like maybe don't critique the thing that gives you pleasure, because then you're not gonna like it as much. And one of the things that I asked them to do, the parameters that I gave them for that assignment is so that don't do something from the academy. This needs to be something in a general kind of a shared set of texts. And I told them they could only use one side of an 8.5 by 14-inch piece of paper. Sorry for the measurements that don't make any sense except for in that one spot of the world, or the two spots of the world. And they could use one side of it, and that was it. I'm like, you can use images, you can use words, you can do whatever you want, but that's the only field that you have to convey your analysis, both what is this current events topic or theme or focus that you've chosen, orient the reader to it, the viewer to it, and then provide some analysis. That put these 27 doctoral students into virtual vapor lock. Right? Because you don't get to an advanced level of graduate study without being able to paper your way through a course with your eyes shut. You know how to do that. It's hard in lots of ways, and we spend lots of time with text, but we know how to do that. If you've made it to advanced graduate level work, you know what to do with a book. You may even have lots of strategies of what to do with a book that is deeply confounding to you. You maybe read other books or other texts about that. But to depict something where you just have a sheet of paper and work with one side of the sheet of paper forced a production of knowledge, forced an interaction between the text and the reader that was for many of those students unfamiliar. Now, some of the students who had worked as art therapists or art activists, art educators are like, I have this on lock. I've been waiting for this the whole time, right? So I think some of it is shaking up the modalities through which we come to know, and understanding that if we only come to know through the printed word, particularly this standardized code that I'm speaking to you in, that of course I think everybody in the room knows this, that there's nothing standard about this code in which I'm speaking to you. It is standardized. There are a whole set of practices around it which keep it, collect it, and protect it, and freeze it. So what happens when we convey knowledge or we explore knowledge in modes that are not so standardized? It's one of the things that I think can, that's not, and I wouldn't necessarily call that a decolonial act, but it's something that gets us closer to that. It helps us to imagine a different way of knowing by trying it on. Hi, yes, come on up, and then we'll
Yes,
take a break.
I just wanted to share just that notion of opening up the space in dyads or in dialogical whispers or moments where you're giving some of the power that you've had in terms of being in the front of the crowd and in that colonial position that we've learned. So perhaps there's a way that every space that we use in our everyday lives, no matter which situations that we find ourselves in, how can we interrogate that notion of how that notion of colonialism is shaping the spaces that we find ourselves in?
Right. Who gets to name what knowledge is known in a room?
And how can we use our agency to within those space? I guess that's what I'm trying to come about with.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think one of the things that certainly, I don't know how American-esque or uniquely American this kind of paralysis that I'm about to describe is, but there is certainly a paralysis that comes through to a lot of people who start to understand power dynamics, that they don't want to act out of power that they've come to understand in their social location, that if they're white, male, cisgender, upper middle class, like they come to know, hopefully, that there's a lot of power imbued in that, and that there often comes a paralysis once that power is understood. So what are ways to upend that power and have other flows of power, other flows of knowledge? How do we open up spaces so that, I really like this idea of enabling constraints from Brent Davis and Dennis Sumara. Like, how do you design a space so that there are just enough constraints and just enough structure that a lot of different things can happen, that a lot of different ideas can come up, or a lot of different expressions of ideas can come up. That to me is a helpful way, rather than getting very quickly mired into who has power, who is an ally, who is not an ally, who is in solidarity, who is not in solidarity. These are all very identity fixed kinds of concepts. And I think it's something that doesn't always do service to social locations, but identity more than social locations. So I like the idea of how do we design spaces with just enough structure where we still have to be responsible about those social locations that we've come to know the world through, but that we can open up other ways of knowing in the room as well. So I want to be really conscious of time. I think it's time to wrap, no? I want to thank you all for being in conversation with me a bit and with each other, and I really want to extend an invitation to myself and to all of us in the room to be thinking about what are the kinds of questions that we feel are really taking shape in the space that we're in together and that are looping across many of the presentations. So thank you for sharing that with me.